if there is some sort of connection here, they need to know it and we need to know. What are we looking at here, Paul?
So that's where we got the sample of the wood. Do you feel anything?
Yeah, there's definitely wood right here.
The drilling report sat on the table for 6 hours before anyone in the room finally said what everyone was already thinking. It wasn't because the data was unclear. In fact, the data was extremely clear. The processed results from the latest drilling program, the most precisely targeted series of boreholes ever conducted on Oak Island, had returned signals that left very little room for doubt. This program had been designed by a geological team that had spent nearly a year refining the exact parameters for the operation. Now the instruments were showing results that spoke plainly to the experts who knew how to interpret them. Something was there. Specifically, it was at a depth and location that the 6 people in the room had spent years, some of them decades, trying to identify with this level of precision. The silence in the room felt different from the quiet moments that had followed previous near breakthroughs on Oak Island. Over the years, there had been many moments filled with anticipation, times when the team desperately wanted something to be real, but tried not to get their hopes up too much. This silence was different. The data didn't need belief or optimism. It presented itself with the straightforward authority of numbers that had already been verified 3 separate times before the printed report ever reached the table. Finally, the team's senior drilling consultant put down his copy of the report, removed his reading glasses, and said what everyone had been thinking. This is the location. This is it. Everything we've been searching for is here. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't a hopeful theory. It was a measurement. Season 13 of the modern Oak Island investigation had just produced something that 12 previous seasons, and more than 2 centuries of earlier searches, had been building toward. Not the treasure itself. Not yet. But something that many serious investigators would argue is even more important. The precise location of the chamber. For 228 years, the main question surrounding Oak Island had been simple. Is there really something there? Season 13 answered a very different question. Where exactly is it? For 12 seasons, the modern investigation of Oak Island had gathered an impressive body of evidence. By any reasonable assessment, the findings were compelling. Artifacts had been recovered from various depths beneath the island. Multiple geophysical surveys had identified underground signatures that appeared consistent with engineered structures. Historical records from archives across several continents had been pieced together to create a narrative about the island's possible purpose. Engineering studies suggested who might have built such structures, and roughly when the construction could have occurred. The evidence was convincing, but it still lacked one crucial element: a precise location. Investigators could say something important likely existed somewhere beneath the island, but they could not yet point to a specific coordinate at a specific depth and declare, that is the target. That distinction matters. The difference between something significant might be somewhere below this island, and the target is exactly here. At this depth is the difference between a long-running mystery and a solvable problem. For 228 years, Oak Island had remained the first kind. Season 13 was the first time the investigation seriously attempted to turn it into the second. This shift did not happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate decision made by the investigation's leadership before the season began. Instead of continuing to explore broadly across the island, they chose to focus on precision, prioritizing deeper analysis over wider coverage. In earlier seasons, exploring widely had been necessary. Those years built the foundation of knowledge that made the location question possible to answer. Without the artifacts, the geophysical surveys, the historical research, and the engineering analysis, the team would have had no reliable way to narrow down the search. Season 13 took a different approach. Rather than covering more ground, the team focused on solving the location problem using everything that the previous 12 seasons had already revealed. The main tool for this effort was a carefully designed drilling program. Drilling itself was nothing new on Oak Island. The island has a long history of drilling attempts, many of which provided valuable information. previous boreholes had produced core samples that helped define the island's geological structure. Some had unexpectedly encountered pieces of structural material buried deep underground. Others produced fragments of evidence, small pieces of a much larger puzzle. Each drilling campaign contributed something important, but none had been designed specifically to pinpoint an exact location. Season 13 was different. Before the drilling even began, the geological team spent 11 months preparing. Their work started with a complete reanalysis of every borehole that had ever been drilled on the island. They didn't just review the results from those holes. They also examined how each one related spatially to the others, their positions, their depths, and the geological signatures recorded in each location. When mapped together as a complete dataset instead of separate experiments, the island's long drilling history revealed patterns that no single borehole had been designed to show. Using this information, the team created a detailed three-dimensional geological model of the island's underground structure. Oak Island had been modeled before, but never with this level of data. This new model combined the results of every previous drilling effort with the geophysical survey data collected during the modern investigation. Even with all of that information, the model still contained gaps, areas beneath the island where the available data wasn't dense enough to confidently describe what was underground. Those gaps became the targets for Season 13's drilling program. Instead of choosing locations randomly or relying on intuition, the team selected drilling points that would most effectively fill in the missing pieces of the model. Each new borehole was placed where it could provide the most useful information. The goal was simple: gather enough precise data so the incomplete three-dimensional picture of the island's subsurface could finally resolve into a clear and complete map. And according to the drilling report now sitting on the table, that plan had worked. The drilling program for Season 13 included 22 boreholes, each placed with careful precision. These boreholes were not meant to function as separate investigations. Instead, they were designed as part of a coordinated data-gathering effort. Every borehole added new information to a shared model of the island's underground structure. As each result came in, the model was updated. Those updates then helped determine where the next boreholes should be drilled. In other words, every new piece of data improved the accuracy of the next step. The geological team referred to this strategy as convergent drilling. Rather than drilling to answer individual questions, convergent drilling treats every borehole as part of a larger system designed to solve a single complex problem, one that no single borehole could answer on its own. For Oak Island, that complex question had remained the same since 1795. Where exactly is the primary chamber? The 22 boreholes of the Season 13 drilling program were completed over 6 weeks. It wasn't 6 weeks of dramatic discoveries. Instead, it was 6 weeks of careful, methodical work. While the drilling continued, the team simultaneously processed the data and updated the geological model. This meant the underground picture of the island became clearer as the drilling progressed rather than waiting until all 22 holes were finished. The first several boreholes produced useful but not decisive information. They filled gaps in the existing model, confirmed geological layers that earlier studies had suggested, and helped identify the characteristics of the soil and rock layers in areas where no previous data existed. It was important work, precise and technical, but it mainly built the foundation needed to recognize patterns once enough data had been collected. The turning point came with Borehole 14. Borehole 14 had been placed at a location the evolving model identified as particularly valuable for new information. It was an area where the model still had the highest uncertainty. That meant the results could do one of two things: either confirm the model's predictions and strengthen the entire picture, or reveal differences that required the model to be adjusted. What came back from Borehole 14 did neither. Instead, it revealed an anomaly. At a depth of about 108 feet, the drilling core showed material that did not match the natural geological layers expected in that location. It also didn't match the kinds of disturbances left behind by earlier drilling or excavation on the island. In short, it didn't fit anything already included in the model. The drilling supervisor examined the core sample carefully, studying it section by section with more attention than routine logging procedures required. he wasn't doing this simply for documentation. The material from borehole 14 was clearly telling him something unusual, and he wanted to understand exactly what it meant. At 108 feet, the material showed characteristics that, based on his experience in structural geology, suggested something very specific. It resembled the kind of material that fills the edges of an engineered underground cavity. In other words, the drill had not passed through the empty chamber itself. It had passed through the material surrounding it. That meant the structure wasn't directly beneath the borehole, it was nearby. Using the borehole's exact position, angle, and the characteristics of the surrounding material, the supervisor was able to calculate a direction pointing toward where the cavity likely existed. Once he finished examining the core, he walked over to the modeling station and entered the borehole 14 data. The three-dimensional model recalculated. For the first time in the investigation's history, a specific set of coordinates appeared on the screen as the highest probability location of the primary chamber. The combined data from boreholes 1 through 14 had finally produced a clear result. A location, a depth, and a spatial position that the investigation had never before been able to identify with this level of precision. The supervisor stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he called the rest of the team together. When he presented the model's output, the first statement surprised everyone in the room. The location identified by the Season 13 drilling data was not directly under the money pit. For over 2 centuries, the search for Oak Island's treasure had focused on the money pit. It was the original excavation site, the place where the flood tunnel system had been discovered, and the location that historical records and engineering theories had consistently suggested was the most likely place for the treasure deposit. But the coordinates shown in the model were 67 feet northeast of the main axis of the money pit. That distance was close enough to show the location was clearly connected to the same underground system. Yet it was far enough away to represent a separate location that no previous major excavation had directly targeted. Close, but not the same spot. That small offset suddenly explained several puzzling results from earlier investigations. In previous seasons, nearby boreholes had recovered strange material that investigators couldn't fully explain at the time. Geophysical surveys in the surrounding area had also detected unusual signals that were noted, but ultimately set aside because the focus remained on the money pit itself. Now, those clues made sense. The lead geologist explained the conclusion to the full team as they studied the model. The system was built with an offset, he said. The primary chamber isn't directly beneath the money pit. It's connected to the money pit system. The flood tunnels serve it, and the structural engineering relates to it. But the chamber itself was intentionally placed away from the main access shaft. That design choice also explained something else that had frustrated treasure hunters for generations. The reason the flood defenses have worked so well, he continued, is that when people dig directly into the money pit, they trigger the flood tunnels. Those tunnels fill the access shaft with water, but the chamber itself stays dry because it's about 67 feet away from the center of the flood zone. For the investigators in the room, the implications were immediate. For 228 years, attempts to reach the treasure had followed the same basic strategy: dig down through the money pit. Each attempt eventually reached a depth where flooding destroyed the excavation. But if the chamber was offset by 67 feet, then those efforts had been targeting the correct system, but the wrong exact location. That distance might be enough to place the chamber outside the most destructive area of the flood defense system. In theory, approaching from the newly identified coordinates could allow access to the chamber without triggering the catastrophic flooding that had ended every previous attempt. In other words, the flood defense system might not have been impossible to defeat. It might simply have been paired with a decoy. For generations, the visible history of digging at the money pit pulled every search effort towards the same location, the exact point the island's flood defense system was designed to protect the most. Meanwhile, the real chamber may have been placed slightly away from that spot, intentionally and cleverly hidden nearby. To understand why the drilling program in Season 13 was able to identify the chamber when the previous 12 seasons could not, it's important to understand what the Convergent drilling model actually achieved. It didn't reveal a dramatic new discovery out of nowhere. What it produced was clarity. The kind of clarity that appears when enough data points are gathered and arranged in the correct spatial pattern. When that happens, the overall picture becomes unmistakable. You can think of it like a photograph slowly coming into focus. Early in the investigation, the picture of Oak Island was very low resolution. Investigators could see the general shapes and had a strong sense that something important was underground. But the details, what exactly was there and where it was located, remained unclear. Each season added more data points. Gradually, the resolution improved. Blurry shapes became defined features. General ideas became specific possibilities. Season 13 was the moment when the accumulated data finally reached the resolution threshold, the point where the image became clear enough to read. After the anomaly discovered in borehole 14, the remaining boreholes were no longer searching randomly. Instead, they were positioned specifically to confirm and refine the chamber's location. Each new borehole added supporting evidence for what borehole 14 had suggested. Every result matched the model's predictions. With each confirmation, the uncertainty around the chamber's location became smaller. The coordinates grew more precise, and the evidence supporting them grew stronger. By the time the team reached borehole 22, the geological team could describe the chamber's location with remarkable accuracy. According to their analysis, the center of the chamber was located at the identified coordinates with a margin of error of about 6 feet horizontally and 8 feet vertically, at a depth of approximately 116 feet. That level of precision was something the Oak Island investigation had never achieved before. In earlier studies, geophysical anomalies were often described in large zones that could span dozens of feet. Depth estimates were sometimes based on historical descriptions and indirect clues, leaving uncertainty that could extend across large ranges. Season 13 changed that. The drilling data reduced the uncertainty from the level of educated guessing to the level required for engineering planning. You don't plan a careful excavation around a guess. You plan it around exact coordinates. Season 13 finally produced coordinates accurate to within 6 feet. But the drilling results didn't stand alone. They arrived within the context of 12 previous seasons that had already built a large body of historical, archaeological, and scientific evidence. Once the drilling identified the location, 67 feet northeast of the money pit, at a depth of 116 feet, the team compared that position with every category of evidence gathered during the investigation. The first comparison involved the artifact record. When archaeologists mapped the locations where artifacts had been recovered throughout the investigation and plotted them against the newly identified chamber coordinates, a clear pattern appeared. The artifacts with the most reliable historical origins, the ones most closely tied to the possible time period of the original deposit, were actually located, on average, closer to the newly identified chamber location than to the center of the money pit. This pattern had gone unnoticed before, because artifacts had always been analyzed individually, and the money pit had been assumed to be the center of the system. When the analysis was repeated, using the new coordinates as the center point, the distribution of artifacts suddenly made much more sense. The second comparison involved the geophysical survey data. Over the previous seasons, the investigation had collected survey results using multiple technologies: ground-penetrating radar, seismic studies, and other scanning methods. When this data was re-examined with the new drilling coordinates in mind, several signals that had previously been labeled as minor or peripheral anomalies suddenly became important. These signals came from the exact zone surrounding the newly identified chamber. Before the drilling results, those signals were difficult to interpret because they didn't fall directly under the money pit. But with the new coordinates providing context, the patterns now appeared consistent with the structural features expected from a chamber located at that depth and position. The data had been there all along. What was missing was the context needed to interpret it. The third line of evidence came from historical documentation. Researchers working on the investigation had spent years gathering archival records from different sources and locations. These documents helped build theories about when the chamber might have been constructed and what its purpose could have been. Now, for the first time, Those historical theories could be connected to a specific location underground. With coordinates to attach them to, the historical records suddenly became more meaningful, and the drilling data gained deeper context as well. In the end, 4 independent lines of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Historical documents suggesting a constructed deposit, archaeological artifact patterns that fit the new center point geophysical survey signatures consistent with the structure, and drilling data that defined the exact coordinates. All 4 sources were now converging on the same answer. The 6 hours of silence in the room, while the drilling report sat on the table, was the silence of experts realizing that all the evidence was finally aligning. The 6 people in that room represented more combined knowledge about Oak Island than any group that had ever gathered in one place during the investigation's long history. There was the lead geologist, who had spent 11 months designing the precise drilling program used in Season 13. The drilling supervisor, whose careful examination of the borehole 14 core had revealed the anomaly that changed everything. The lead archaeologist, whose earlier analysis of artifact distribution had just been confirmed by the new drilling coordinates. The senior historical researcher, whose years of archival work provided the historical framework for understanding the site. The geophysical specialist, responsible for building the large archive of survey data that the drilling results were now being compared against. And finally, the person who had brought all of them together, the individual who had funded the investigation and supported it through the many years required to collect the evidence that ultimately allowed Season 13's precision drilling to transform a centuries-old mystery into a set of exact coordinates. 6 people sat around the table, each one bringing a different area of expertise, a different way of interpreting the same report. A geologist, a drilling expert, an archaeologist, a historian, a geophysical specialist, and the person who had supported the entire investigation. 6 different perspectives. Yet, as they studied the report, they all reached the same conclusion. The consultant who finally broke the silence was the one whose professional standards made him the most cautious about making a statement like this. He had spent his career working in structural geology, a field where conclusions must be supported by strong evidence and careful analysis. Because of that background, he was not someone who spoke lightly about discoveries. When he finally said, "This is the location. This is it," everyone in the room understood how much weight those words carried. It wasn't excitement speaking. It was professional judgment. It was the calm, measured conclusion of someone who had examined the data carefully and determined that the evidence met the strict standards his career had always required. After he spoke, the room fell silent again. But this silence felt different from the one before. The first silence had been the quiet moment before anyone said what they were all beginning to realize. The second silence was the moment after it had been spoken, when everyone else was processing what that conclusion truly meant. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more fascinating mysteries and discoveries, please subscribe to the Timefold channel and don't forget to like the video.